They said he had lost everything. His house, his business, his reputation. People whispered his name like a warning. But when the auction began and the first bid was announced, the room realized they had misunderstood him completely. If you enjoy stories where the truth arrives quietly, stay with me and consider subscribing. His name was Adrian Cole. Once, he had been respected, not famous, not flashy, but reliable. A man whose handshake meant something in the business world of the city. His firm specialized in strategic acquisitions, buying struggling companies, restructuring them, and returning them to profitability. It was unglamorous work that required patience, insight, and an understanding of market cycles that few possessed. Adrian had built his reputation over 15 years. He lived modestly despite his success. A comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, a sensible car, dinners at local restaurants, not exclusive clubs. He preferred substance over spectacle, results over recognition, until the collapse, a business failure that made headlines. It started with a partnership, a massive joint venture involving 3 firms, including Adrian's. The project was ambitious, a mixed-use development that promised to revitalize an entire district. Investors poured in millions. The city council offered incentives. News outlets celebrated it as a model for urban renewal. Then the market shifted. Interest rates climbed. Supply chains stalled. Construction costs doubled. What had seemed like a calculated risk suddenly became a financial disaster. The project hemorrhaged money. Within 18 months, the entire venture collapsed under the weight of its own debt. Partners walked away. Friends disappeared. The other firms filed for bankruptcy protection, their executives pointing fingers in every direction. Adrian's name appeared in every article, every analysis, every post-mortem. He became the face of the failure, whether he deserved it or not. They said he was finished. Adrian didn't argue. He didn't defend himself in the press. He didn't hire crisis management consultants or launch media campaigns. He simply stepped back, accepted responsibility for his role, and began the quiet work of dismantling what remained. He sold what he could. His office building went first, then the company vehicles, office furniture, equipment, even the artwork that had decorated the conference rooms. Everything was liquidated methodically, systematically, without emotion, moved into a smaller place. The comfortable house in the quiet neighborhood was sold. Adrian moved into a modest apartment on the edge of town, 2 bedrooms, minimal furnishings, a place that felt temporary even though he knew it might not be, became invisible. To everyone else, he was a man rebuilding from nothing. A cautionary tale about hubris and miscalculation. Someone who had reached too far and paid the price. People saw him occasionally at the grocery store, at the gas station, walking through the park, and they recognized him but pretended not to. It was easier that way. Easier than acknowledging what failure looked like up close. To Adrian, he was preparing. While others saw endings, he saw timelines. While they saw loss, he saw repositioning. The collapse had been painful, yes, but it had also been clarifying. It stripped away everything except what truly mattered: capital, patience, and timing. Adrian spent his evenings studying market reports. He tracked the aftermath of the development project carefully, noting which creditors were pressing claims, which assets remained entangled in litigation, which properties would eventually be seized and auctioned. He built spreadsheets that mapped out scenarios, projections, opportunities. He wasn't rebuilding from nothing. He was building towards something. At cafes, conversations stopped when he walked in, not with hostility, but with awkwardness. The kind of silence that happens when no one knows what to say. Adrian would order his coffee, nod politely to familiar faces, and take a seat by the window. Sometimes people would offer sympathetic smiles. Sometimes they would simply look away. At gatherings, invitations faded. The professional network he had spent years cultivating quietly contracted. Networking events he used to attend regularly suddenly filled up before he could register. Board positions he had held were quietly reassigned. Colleagues who had once sought his advice now returned his calls days late, if at all. People pitied him. You'll bounce back someday. At least you tried. These things happen in business. The comments came wrapped in kindness, but carried an unmistakable finality. They were speaking to someone whose chapter had closed, whose moment had passed. Adrian heard the subtext clearly. You're done. He smiled politely, because explaining would have ruined everything. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Adrian had exited the failed venture months before the final collapse. He had seen the signs early. The reluctance of banks to extend additional credit, the growing tension between partners, the way investors started asking pointed questions during quarterly calls. So he had acted, not publicly, not dramatically, but decisively. He had converted his equity positions into secured debt, protecting his capital structure. He had negotiated side agreements that gave him first rights to specific assets if liquidation became necessary. He had quietly sold personal holdings in the development project to a trust he controlled through layered corporate structures. When the collapse came, Adrian lost his reputation, but he had protected his resources. The pity of others was simply the price of privacy. If people believed he was ruined, they wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't scrutinize his finances. They wouldn't wonder what he was planning. He let them believe the story they preferred. It was easier that way. Easier than explaining that sometimes you have to appear weak to remain invisible. Easier than revealing that the greatest strategic advantage in business is being underestimated. Adrian maintained his routine. He lived simply, spent carefully, and kept his activities deliberately mundane. He shopped at discount stores. He drove a 10-year-old sedan. He wore the same clothes until they looked worn. Every detail reinforced the narrative that others had constructed about him. Meanwhile, he continued his research. He tracked every asset tied to the failed development. He monitored bankruptcy proceedings across 3 jurisdictions. He identified which creditors were sophisticated and which were simply desperate to recover anything. He calculated the likely floor price for every property that would eventually come to auction. And he waited. Because in business, as in life, timing determines everything. Months later, the city buzzed about a major auction. Properties, companies, assets seized after a corporate collapse. The bankruptcy court had finally untangled the mess enough to begin liquidation. Everything would be sold in a single event, a massive auction designed to settle claims and close the chapter on the failed development project. Ironically, the same collapse Adrian was blamed for. The auction announcement appeared in legal notices in business publications. Prime commercial properties, undeveloped land parcels with approved zoning, equipment, and inventory. Even the intellectual property and branding rights associated with the original project. The business community watched with interest. Vulture funds circled, sensing opportunity. Local developers studied the listings, calculating which pieces might fit their portfolios. Investors flew in from other cities, drawn by the prospect of acquiring distressed assets at significant discounts. Adrian attended quietly. No entourage, no attention. He registered under his own name, no corporate shell, no proxy bidder, just Adrian Cole, individual buyer. The registration clerk recognized him, paused briefly, then processed his paperwork without comment. What was there to say? Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what had happened, just a man sitting in the back row. The auction was held in the city's convention center, a cavernous space that accommodated the hundreds of potential bidders. Adrian arrived early but sat in the back, away from the prominent seats near the auctioneer's podium where serious buyers typically position themselves. He wore a simple suit, not expensive, not cheap. He carried a leather portfolio that had seen better days. He looked like someone who was curious but not competitive. Someone attending to see what might have been, not someone planning to participate meaningfully. Around him, the room filled with confidence. Developers in tailored suits discussed strategy with their advisors. Investment fund managers worked their phones, coordinating with partners. Lawyers reviewed bidding limits and approval thresholds. These were people accustomed to winning, accustomed to acquiring assets that others couldn't afford. Adrian sat quietly. He didn't network. He didn't introduce himself. He simply reviewed his notes, rechecked his calculations, and waited for the auction to begin. People who recognized him glanced over occasionally, then looked away. What could Adrian Cole possibly bid on? What resources could he possibly have? The consensus was clear. He was here as an observer, perhaps to watch others claim the assets he had once helped assemble. No one suspected the truth, that this was his auction, that every property about to be offered was something he had studied for months, that he had come here with resources they couldn't imagine and a strategy they couldn't anticipate. The auctioneer took the podium. The room settled into anticipatory silence, and Adrian Cole prepared to remind everyone of a fundamental truth. In business, the greatest victories belong to those who prepare when others panic. The auctioneer began. A practiced professional with decades of experience, he explained the rules efficiently. All sales final. Payment terms required within 72 hours. Minimum bid increments clearly posted. The atmosphere was businesslike, almost clinical. The first property was announced. A commercial building in the downtown district. 12 stories. Good bones but needed updating. Ideal for conversion to mixed-use, residential, and retail. The auctioneer provided the details. Square footage, zoning classification, current encumbrances, then the first bid. The auctioneer opened at a price significantly below market value, the whole point of distressed asset auctions. A familiar voice filled the room. I'll take it. Clear, confident. Coming from the back row. Heads turned. Adrian. His arm was raised, his expression neutral. He looked directly at the auctioneer, ignoring the stares from around the room. People laughed softly. It seemed almost sweet, in a tragic way. Adrian Cole making a symbolic gesture, trying to reclaim something from the wreckage of his former success. Someone in the third row whispered to their colleague, "He's probably maxed out his credit cards for this," until the auctioneer nodded. Opening bid accepted. "Do I have a counter?" A brief pause. Then a developer, 3 rows ahead, raised his hand. The price increased by the minimum increment. Adrian responded immediately. "Double the current bid." The room shifted. Doubling wasn't standard procedure in auctions. It was aggressive. It signaled serious intent and deep resources. The developer who had countered frowned, conferred with his advisor, then shook his head and sat back. "Sold," the auctioneer announced, bringing down his gavel. Then the second bid came. The next property was announced, a parking structure adjacent to the first building, separately owned in the original development, but obviously valuable to whoever controlled the building itself. Again, Adrian. His bid came before the auctioneer even finished describing the property. Higher than the opening price. High enough to discourage casual interest, but not so high that it seemed reckless. Property after property. Bid after bid. A vacant lot with commercial zoning. Adrian. An office building that needed significant renovation. Adrian. A parcel of waterfront land that had been designated for residential development. Adrian. Each time, his bids were strategic. Sometimes he opened aggressively to discourage competition. Sometimes he let others bid first, then came over the top with numbers that ended discussion. He won some properties easily. Others required multiple rounds. But he won. The room grew silent. The laughter had stopped completely now. The whispers had transformed into something else, confusion mixed with dawning realization. People began checking their programs, recalculating what Adrian had just spent, trying to understand where the money was coming from. Investment fund managers started pulling up information on their phones. Who was backing Adrian Cole? What consortium had he assembled? What leverage was he using? But there were no answers. Just Adrian, sitting in the back row, bidding methodically on property after property. Someone finally asked the question everyone feared. Where is he getting the money? A prominent developer, a man who had personally profited from Adrian's downfall by hiring away several of his former employees, stood up and addressed the room. I would like to verify the bidder's financial capacity. It was within rights. Auction rules allowed challenges to ensure bidders could actually complete purchases. The auctioneer nodded. Mr. Cole, can you provide proof of funds? Adrian stood slowly. He walked down the aisle toward the podium, his worn portfolio in hand. Every eye in the room followed him. The silence was absolute. He handed the auctioneer a single document. The auctioneer reviewed it, his eyes widening slightly. He checked something on his computer, then nodded. Funds verified. Bidding continues. But the developer who had challenged Adrian wasn't satisfied. What funds? From what source? The auctioneer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, I'm not required to disclose. It's fine, Adrian said quietly. He turned to face the room. The answer arrived quietly. The collapse hadn't ruined me, Adrian said. It freed me. He explained calmly, without theatrics. He had exited early, months before the final collapse, when he saw the venture was unsalvageable. Adrian had systematically protected his position. He had converted equity to secured debt. He had negotiated agreements that gave him priority claims on specific assets. He had sold his remaining stake to a trust structure he controlled, liquidated privately. While partners fought publicly and blamed each other in depositions, Adrian had quietly converted everything he could into liquid capital. He sold personal investments. He leveraged relationships with private lenders who understood his track record. He built a war chest, protected what mattered. Not his reputation that was always going to be sacrificed in a collapse this public, but his resources. His ability to act when opportunity emerged. His capacity to be ready when others were exhausted. When everyone panicked, Adrian continued, I repositioned. While others were defending themselves in court and managing PR disasters, Adrian was studying the assets that would eventually be liquidated. He knew these properties better than anyone he had helped acquire most of them originally. He understood their potential, their limitations, their true value. He had spent months calculating the likely auction prices. He had secured financing commitments. He had structured his bids to maximize efficiency. He had prepared for this day the way a chess master prepares for an endgame, thinking 20 moves ahead. The auction wasn't a gamble. It was a return, not to his former reputation that might take years to rebuild, if it ever could be, but a return to position, to ownership, to control of assets he understood better than anyone in the room. I appreciate everyone's concern about my financial capacity, Adrian said, his voice carrying an edge now. But I assure you, every bid I've made is backed by verified funds, and I intend to continue bidding. He walked back to his seat in the back row. The room remained silent. Faces changed. The pity vanished. What replaced it was more complex confusion mixed with grudging, respect, embarrassment blended with recalculation. People who had written Adrian off were now mentally rewriting his story, trying to reconcile the man they had pitied with the strategic mind that had apparently been operating all along. Replaced by confusion, then respect. The auction continued, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Adrian was no longer an observer or a symbolic bidder. He was the dominant force in the room. When he bid, others hesitated. When he passed, people wondered why he had deemed a property unworthy. Developers who had ignored him now watched his every movement. Which properties was he clustering? What strategy was driving his selections? The pattern became clear to those paying attention. Adrian wasn't just buying individual assets. He was reassembling the core pieces of the original development, the properties with the greatest long-term potential. The same people who ignored him now watched closely. During breaks, advisors approached Adrian cautiously. Would he consider partnership on certain properties? Would he be interested in immediate resale at a premium? Was he planning to develop the properties himself or hold them for appreciation? Adrian listened politely, but committed to nothing. He didn't celebrate. When he won a bid, he simply noted it in his portfolio and prepared for the next property. There was no fist pumping, no satisfied smiles, no celebratory phone calls. He treated each acquisition like a business transaction, which is exactly what it was. He didn't explain. People wanted the story. Journalists from business publications approached during breaks, requesting interviews. Former colleagues sent text messages asking if the rumors were true. But Adrian remained silent. The facts spoke clearly enough for anyone willing to see them. He simply finished what he started. By the end of the auction, Adrian had acquired 11 properties. Not every property he had let several go when the bidding exceeded his calculated value. But the core assets, the properties that formed the foundation of a coherent development strategy, were now his. The financial commitment was enormous. The execution risk was substantial. But Adrian had prepared for both. This channel tells stories for anyone who's ever been misunderstood during their quiet seasons. Some losses are real. Adrian understood this better than most. The damage to his reputation was genuine. The relationships that had ended were truly over. The period of struggle and isolation had been authentic, not performance art. Others are strategic. But within that real loss, Adrian had made strategic choices. He had chosen silence over defense. He had chosen preparation over reputation management. He had chosen to appear weak because appearing weak kept him invisible while he repositioned. And sometimes, the moment everyone thinks you've fallen is when you're actually stepping back into control. Weeks after the auction, as contracts were finalized and properties transferred, Adrian began assembling a new team. Not his former employees, most had moved on, and he wished them well. But new talent, people who judged him on his current vision rather than his past failure. The development project he was planning was more modest than the original, more realistic, better capitalized, designed with the lessons of the previous failure built into every assumption. He worked from a small office, not the impressive headquarters of his previous firm. He met with investors, city officials, architects, contractors. This time, everything was different. This time, he controlled the timeline, the partnerships, the risk allocation. People in the city began to reassess Adrian Cole, not as the cautionary tale they had believed, but as something more complicated, someone who had lost authentically but planned strategically. Someone who had accepted a painful present in service of a calculated future. He would never fully escape the shadow of the collapse. There would always be people who remembered only the failure, who saw only the headlines from the worst moment. Adrian accepted that. But for those willing to look closer, to understand the full arc of the story, Adrian Cole had demonstrated something valuable. That wisdom sometimes looks like weakness. That patience can be mistaken for defeat, that the quietest seasons are often the most important, and that true recovery doesn't mean returning to where you were, it means arriving somewhere better. Subscribe for more billionaire stories where patience turns setbacks into power.